Ambassador Jane Hardy.
Aloha and welcome to Australia Day 2021 in Honolulu.
Hardy represents a tree, the tree of the dream time. The tree and its branches represent a protector of our culture and our community.
We are not just a group, we are a family. It gives me great pride to be able to represent our culture. We are seeing this in Darwin.
Ochre's the rock play of the earth. We do this painting for our dances and our songs, connecting us to nature. For me, it's important to represent my culture. I don't want our languages to be forgotten. We can show Australia and the world that one of the oldest living cultures needs to be heard.
To be able to perform at such a big stage like this and just gather more people in so they can understand our culture, it's absolutely
Aloha. Thank you, Ambassador Hardy and the Office of the Consulate-General of Australia for organizing this webinar to commemorate Australia Day. Don and I are honored to be joining you virtually this year.
COVID-19 has changed the way we get together, but it will not stop us from celebrating the long friendship between Australia and Hawaii. Our relationship will be reinforced with the upcoming Hawaiʻi Triennial 2022, led by Director Dr. Melissa Chiu. We look forward to today's prelude to HT22, showcasing Hawaii and Australia artists in commemoration of the 2021 Australia Day.
The people of Australia and Hawaii share similar values and a common vision of a peaceful, stable, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. We remain committed to promoting Hawaii-Australia's friendship through business, educational exchanges, tourism, visual and performing arts. We wish you a successful program and look forward to HT22. Aloha.
Today, Australia Day 2021, is the first for many years that we're not together at beautiful Washington Place with Governor David Ige and Mrs. Dawn Amano Ige. But Governor and Mrs. Ige and many of our friends in Hawaii have joined us today. Aloha to you all and mahalo for your support. Australia Day tells the story of our extraordinary nation. The story begins more than 65,000 years ago. New chapters are written every day. Today we reflect on our history, its highs and its lows, and we share our stories and we celebrate our achievements. Across Australia at events like this, which is socially distanced as we continue to battle the pandemic, Indigenous elders give their welcome to country in one of 300 Australian Indigenous languages. You've heard our national anthem being sung today in the Dharawal language from the Sydney region. We pay our respects to Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging. The oldest continuing culture in the world is alive in our society, which is also composed of people who have immigrated from more than 200 nations. We're one of the most diverse societies on earth. The pandemic has defied our attempts to limit its spread. We've stopped most international travel and changed ordinary life. We pay tribute to the frontline health workers of Hawaii and of our own country, and to the brilliance of scientists who have generated a glimmer of light at the end of this tunnel with new vaccines. We thank Governor Ige and the state of Hawaii for all they have done to protect us. The past year has taught us many things. We've developed new skills online, and this new internet world is a powerful audiovisual world. Great music and art has reached new audiences. People who cannot leave the safety of their homes can virtually visit magnificent art galleries and museums on the internet. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce you to a preeminent Australian, Dr. Melissa Chiu. Dr. Chiu is director of the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, one of the world-leading Smithsonian institutions that line the National Mall in Washington, DC. In the coming year, Melissa will bring to Hawaii some extraordinary visual art. Next month, 10th to 13th of February, the inaugural Hawaiʻi Contemporary Art Summit 2021 will run a series of events on these islands with artists and communities and thought leaders. This virtual summit will preview the 2022 Hawaiʻi Triennial, which promises to be a grand festival of visual arts. Melissa Chiu will lead the Triennial's curatorial team, gathering art and artists from across the Indo-Pacific region, including from Australia. A quick introduction to Melissa Chiu. Melissa was born in Darwin in Northern Australia and gained her degrees from the University of Western Sydney and the University of New South Wales. Melissa has published books and catalogues on contemporary art, and she's also lectured at Harvard and Yale, Columbia, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, among others. Melissa has led the Hirshhorn since 2014. Under her direction, the Hirshhorn has maintained its focus on 20th and 21st century art and energised the art scene with landmark exhibitions. I can think of no better way to celebrate Australia Day than to introduce Dr. Melissa Chiu, an eminent Australian curator, who will give us a sneak peek at the coming rich art experience which will roll out here in Hawaii. Hi, Melissa.
Hello, Ambassador Hardy.
Just before I ask my own questions of you, I want to ask our audience today to think of their questions as they listen to you speak and to drop them into the chat function on Zoom so that we have an interactive session coming up where they can pose direct questions to you. So everyone, have a look at that on your screen and think of some questions. So Melissa, Dr. Chiu, let's start at the beginning. Please tell me about your role in the Hawaiʻi Contemporary as a curatorial director for the coming Hawaiʻi Triennial 2022.
Well, I'm very honored to be able to participate, collaborate, and be involved in the next Hawaiʻi Triennial next year. Imagine that. I'm working with fellow curators, Drew Broderick, who is based in Honolulu, and Waka Tezuka, who's based in New York. And we are collaborating on an exhibition across the city of Honolulu that has a thematic focus with the main goal of really looking carefully at this moment in time and being responsive to what we think are important cultural developments.
Very interesting. We look forward to that. And I know your theme for the Triennial is the Pacific Century. I was really thrilled to read that because the Pacific Century is a phrase that we in government have used for a long time now. Australia, the United States, and many countries here in this region have used it to describe what really began several decades ago. It heralded the impressive changes that took place here in the Asia Pacific. So a big shift was underway, the rise of China, the, of course, extraordinary achievements of Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, and India. So we call this the Pacific Century, but I wonder to an art audience, what does the Pacific Century mean and how will this take place next year?
So it would be true to say that the Pacific Century is more often used as a geopolitical term to suggest the 21st century, time in which the Asia Pacific is growing in political and economic importance. However, with the Hawaiʻi Triennial, we're very interested in the cultural implications of that. What kind of cultural questions might this raise? And within this, very interested in new cultural ideas around what it means to reorient ourselves away from perhaps a center-periphery kind of model and more towards one where Hawaii might be considered central. And so it is through our, in a way, our exploration of a lot of art practices that are very of this moment that allow us to explore what we are thinking of as a kind of moment in which we can take stock and look at the kind of nuances or complexities around new art that maybe wouldn't have been considered central 20, 30 years ago, but is very central today.
That's very interesting. I mean, living here in Hawaii, we think of ourselves as the center of the universe. We're certainly the center of the Pacific Ocean. You know, like Australia, Hawaiians now think of ourselves in the middle of a blue continent, the oceanic continent of the Pacific. Australia too, it used to be the tyranny of distance from our, you know, northern hemisphere origins, but now we think of ourselves as that doesn't matter. We now have the great advantage of a proximity. I see your own history began in Sydney, or some of it, and that was at the 4A Centre for Contemporary Asian Art in Haymarket, a great little part of the beautiful city of Sydney. Melissa, could you describe how your own history there might relate to what you're doing with the Pacific Century as a theme for the coming triennial and for the summit next month?
So I think, you know, one of the reasons why Pacific Century evolved as an important theme for us was as much the geographic location of Hawaii, being somewhere in the midpoint between the US and the Asia Pacific region. And I would also say that what interested me in my work at 4A, and it was a long time ago now, and it really has evolved in a remarkable way in Sydney as an important kind of institution within the ecology of Australia and its engagement with the Asia Pacific region. And I think, if anything, that experience in Australia helped me to understand in some way what it might be like to think about artists and curation that allows for a kind of a sense of openness, a sense of being open to new possibilities that might present themselves. And so in some ways that 4A experience was really important for me to understand not just art practice from a very grassroots artist-run initiative background, but also kind of an openness to some of the difficulties and challenges around understanding cultural complexities. So it was making an argument at that time for the inclusion, for example, of Asian Australian artists into a consideration of Australian art. And so in some ways, the Pacific Century is something of, although there's maybe 20 years between 4A and today in terms of my lived experience, I think I still remain very interested in what it means to create moments of kind of openness. And by that I mean an openness towards change, towards thinking about artists from many different places and different experiences being able to have a voice.
Let's turn to some of the artists. I think there are some lovely images we have here. I believe this is Sydney-based artist Justine Yusuf, who recently had her first major solo exhibition at 4A in Sydney. Melissa, could you describe Justine's work and for our Hawaiian audience?
So I think what really attracted us to Justine's work, and here you see some images of some of the exhibitions that she's had in Sydney, was the fact that she's using materials, mostly everyday materials, to look very carefully at her Lebanese heritage. And in many of her work, she draws on what are both diaspora, diaspora understanding of her Lebanese family background and heritage, but also first-hand encounters since she went back to Lebanon and really reconnected with her family, and that formed the basis of a number of her works. She has used materials such as coal, the makeup coal, to demonstrate these kinds of cultural connections, but also another wonderful performance where she distilled rose water from roses that were English roses as a kind of symbolic idea of an introduced species that the English rose is on the Australian landscape, and then distilled that from those rose petals, rose water that then she had created and placed in small bottles that people could very see visibly as part of that process. So I think, if anything, Justine's work speaks to an artist who is wanting to reconnect with her Lebanese heritage through a sense of materiality.
Well, that's fascinating. And I remember growing up, the Lebanese diaspora in Australia was the largest in the world, particularly in Melbourne. That we all grew up eating Lebanese food. Let's turn to another artist. So this is the Richard Bell, and I don't know if the pictures will show this, but he is such a character. He's an Australian Indigenous man from Queensland, and he's famous for what he says activating his Aboriginal tent embassy, his embassy installation in many parts of the world. This is like a continuing artwork, and he uses this as a direct reference to the original Aboriginal tent embassy, which many Australians will know. It was first established in 1972, and it still exists. It's now quite a few different structures, and it's a very interesting place just outside of Old Parliament House in Canberra. It draws attention essentially to issues of Indigenous sovereignty, and in the 1970s that was the land rights movement, which was so powerful. So now the word embassy, to a functioning diplomat like myself, it has a special meaning. It's used a lot, but to me it means a very special place that's designated by a government as a sovereign space, often located on soil of another country, and the ambassador and the ambassador's team use that space to draw in people from their host, the place where they're living, their host government and their host society. And it is a convening place, a place to convene discussions, often about the future, to imagine a new future, and to then work out bit by bit how, with your host government, you are going to bring this to reality. Now, that sounds pretty grandiose, but they're very significant ideas, and it's at the heart of a diplomatic function that you do that. And Richard's embassy is exactly that. It is a tent, but it's an embassy. And I think it's where he imagines the future and negotiates with quote unquote foreign powers to realize the future. So this is a very interesting artwork that pops up all over the world. Melissa, how do you anticipate Richard Bell's embassy would resonate here in Hawaii?
Well, I think that at the heart of Richard's intention in this work that he's titled Embassy, which, as you mentioned, is really a reference to the 1972 Aboriginal tent embassy that was established in Canberra. And so, in a way, at the heart of Richard's embassy work is this idea of providing a place where people can come together. The tent is, in a way, just a conceptual idea. It's a physical tent, but the concept is really about creating a community. And he's installed this around the world. Although the original tent embassy in Canberra was about native title and Aboriginals' rights to the land in a formal government petition, Richard's actually has a broader goal, in my view, and that is really to create a way of people coming together to talk about topical issues that may relate to native title, or they may not around the world. We know that just about everywhere in the world there are issues around land rights, but there are also issues around the environment and many other, sometimes political, sometimes not, issues. And I think that really Richard's creation of this embassy work is really, although it was done in 2013, I think it's very much of this moment that he's trying to create almost a safe space for conversation at a moment when there are so few places where one can have a kind of a civil discourse.
Yes, and the film of Richard's discussions inside the tents in various parts of the world, they're both delightful and serious. And that's what any good diplomatic function should be. So I hope everyone gets a chance to see those. So let's turn to next month. Between the 10th and 13th of February, the Hawaii'i Contemporary Art Summit will screen films by, amongst other people, Carabing Film Collective. And the members of that collective will have conversations with Elizabeth Pavanelli, and also you mentioned your Hawaiʻi Triennial Associate Curator, Drew Broderick, who I believe is with us today. It was great meeting him recently. The Carabing Film Collective is an important example of the power of intergenerational storytelling, in my view. Melissa, could you describe it for us?
So the Carabing Collective is a group of 30 members, and they produce films, sometimes just only with their video cameras, that they then edit into really compelling videos that kind of bring together a documentary style, sometimes with other kind of very imaginative imagery. And I think it gives you a glimpse into these individuals' lives, and with that, some of the challenges that they face. We know that Carabing is, in their language, it means this idea of low tide, and what's translated as low tide, and what that can mean, or we can interpret it as an idea of a sense of collective determination. And I think that idea of strength and survival in the face of great difficulty is what really comes out of these films. And I encourage all of you to watch them.
Oh, that's wonderful. I look forward to seeing those and to seeing the beauty of the landscape. The land is so important to all Aboriginal people, and they have a very special relationship to it, as many do Native people here in Hawaii also. I think that'll be a very clear understanding. Now, getting back to Australia, one of my all-time favourite things to do in Australia is to go to the Asia Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art, which is held every 3 years at the Queensland Art Gallery in Brisbane. And at times over the years, I've even convinced some of my diplomatic friends, foreign diplomats, to make their visit to Australia coincide with the timing of this beautiful event. So I think Richard Bell was a great hit there in 2016, I remember. And over the years, I've seen different things there from across the Asia Pacific. I remember seeing a painted Indian elephant. It wasn't a live elephant. No animals were harmed, but it was the most magnificent artwork. And I saw an installation of a Chinese hutong, this old form of living, which is not disappearing, but is less obvious in China today. And I saw beautiful paintings and sculptures, headdresses, magnificent sharks from our own Torres Strait Islanders there in the gallery, which is a tropical museum. It's open to the elements in a lot of aspects, and it's on the banks of the Brisbane River. So, Melissa, you've been involved in this. Could you tell us about your experiences with the Asia Pacific Triennial and how this might have influenced your approach to the coming Hawaiʻi Triennial?
So I'm a big fan of the APT. Actually, it was one of the very first periodical exhibitions that brought together artists from all over the Asia Pacific region. And the first one of its kind was in 1993, which made it really important. It was really a remarkable event, and then it has continued, and now is very much an important date on the cultural calendar. Richard is one of many artists that have really been able to do major works for that exhibition. And I know that the museum, the Queensland Art Gallery, has been acquiring and collecting works from the APTs for their collection. So I think for anyone who's interested in the Asia Pacific region, that the APT is just one of those very important events that allows you to see all in the one place at the one moment, really what's been going on across the region. And so it really does play an important role, and has historically played an important role in terms of us understanding some of the real movements and important key works of that part of the world.
Thank you. I think it makes me a little homesick that I can't go back to Australia and see some of this, but I think when we can all travel again, God willing, we'll be able to entice some of our Hawaiian friends to this beautiful part of Australia. The climate's almost or very similar to that of Hawaii, and I think you'll be amazed and intrigued, and we'd love to have you there. But now let's turn to some questions from our participants, our other participants today.
Hello, I'm Jane Hardy. I hope you can see me. So I have some questions. Melissa, perhaps you can let me know that you can see me.
I cannot see you.
Okay, I'm going to ask my staff for a little bit of help here. I cannot turn on my video, so it has to be turned on remotely. But look, perhaps, Melissa, if you're up on the screen there, I can nevertheless start these lovely questions. We've had a number of questions, and I will attempt to summarize them. So the first one comes from Gabby, and Gabby asks, Melissa, what inspired you to become part of the art world, and what was the trigger for your career?
So, I'm sorry, Ambassador Hardy, would you mind repeating the question?
Certainly. So the question is from Gabby, and it's a question about what inspired you to become part of the art world. What memories do you have, early memories of being interested in art, and what inspired you?
So I think actually art had been an important part of my life from when I was very young. Actually, although there wasn't really an art museum where when I was young in Darwin, but when I moved to Sydney, there were many museums, and I really did enjoy going to them. And you know, as I kind of started to think about where I could make a difference, I kind of got more and more interested in the galleries in Sydney, and then ultimately the museums as well.
Oh, okay. That's obviously where it started. I have another question from Lee Lundin. Thank you, Ambassador Hardy and Dr. Chiu, for the fascinating discussion. As a member of the Society of Asian Art for Hawaii, I'm interested to learn more about Asian Australian artists who work with Asian aesthetics and subject matters. Can you comment about that, Melissa?
Sure. So it's very difficult to generalize, of course. So a lot of the work that I did do while I was living in Australia was really focused on the work of Asian Australian artists. And so within that, it was really also a way of looking at diversity of practices, but also tending to the differences that each and every artist had towards their different cultural backgrounds. So what I could say about it is that while some artists were somewhat ambivalent about their Asian heritage and really didn't see it as being important at all to their work, there were some artists who, on the other hand, it was a very important part of their practice. And so within that, it was many of those artists who we showed at 4A, for those artists who kind of really wanted to identify with their Asian heritage and make that a part of their art practice. So it's very difficult to really think in, it's an easier scenario to think in more general terms than specifics, because each artist is really different in terms of their approach.
Yes, of course. And there's another really interesting question. You grew up in Darwin, or you were born in Darwin, I think. Mm-hmm. And there's a question from Robert. Did growing up in Darwin give you an interesting perspective on Aboriginal art and culture?
That's a great question, because it's something that I don't think I've ever really thought a lot about, but I do remember that in our work at 4A, which was a focus on Asian Australian artists, we were often including Aboriginal voices and collaborating with Aboriginal artists. And if I were to think about my background in Darwin, I would say that although it wasn't a part of my education, it was present. There was a presence of Indigenous people. And now as we see Darwin, it's become much more a central focus for the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Artist Islander Award and other things like that. So it's become more important in the Aboriginal art world. When I was growing up, it was a long time ago, and so it wasn't as formalized or institutionalized. But I do think, looking back, that it has helped me to have something of some understanding of where Aboriginal art came from, because I did travel throughout the Northern Territory as a child as well.
Yes, and now just moving north in our minds across the Torres Strait and into the Oceania region, we've got a question from Ricardo, which is very interesting. Here in Hawaii and around Oceania, there's a very special focus on climate change, of course, but also pollution and plastics. And he asks whether this challenge is being addressed by artists and art galleries.
So it's a good question. I think that there are many artists today who are creating works in response to climate change and the issues around the environment. I think there's been less thought given to how our current ways of working respond to issues around climate change. So I think that one of the broader discussions obviously is towards less travel, less shipping, less packing, all of those kinds of auxiliary things that go towards making an exhibition. And I think that it's a very good point that we all have a lot more work to do on.
Yes, that's true. It's such a rich cultural heritage. We're only just beginning to discover, at least non-Aboriginal people. At least the rest of us who observe the art world. So, Dr. Chiu, a question from Sue. How do you find new artists? This is an interesting question. And new ideas as a curator.
Yes, so where once the model would have been to travel the world, in fact, triennials and biennials, the usual model is that a curator travels the world and sees new things and then brings them into the exhibition. And this moment has meant a new kind of working. If I were to think of the way that we've been able to work as a curatorial team with Drew Broderick, my co-curators in Honolulu, Drew Broderick, and Miwako Tezuka in New York, and it's been all virtual, and we've been in contact with many people around the world to hear from them of recommendations and doing research online. So it's very much a virtual experience right now. And I think it's been for the better. It's been a way of reaching out to people to see how they are and to see what they've seen in their local art scenes that has been of value. So that's been our way of working over the past few months that I think is in common with everyone else.
Right. Now, Amanda Ellis has posed a really good question. She says, it's so enriching to have an expert explanation to help the layperson more deeply appreciate the art. So will you, Dr. Chiu, be using this technique for the upcoming Hawaii event also?
So yes, I think the answer is yes. We're all at an unusual moment, and I think that we are doing our best to be able to do research and curate online from online experiences, and we'd like to do much more on the education piece as well, and that's what the summit coming up next month is really all about. It's a little bit of a sneak peek of some of the key ideas around the exhibition that we have planned now next year.
Yes, so everyone please pay attention to that. It's from 10th to 13th of February. It'll be very exciting. And there's another question here. You've selected some intriguing Australian artworks to show, and they're very conceptual and not traditional in the way that paintings on a wall might be traditional. And the question is, how do you find the audiences respond to these kinds of installations?
So it's true that installation art is one of the newer genres that first really developed in the 1970s. What I would say about it, having evolved over these past few decades, is that it's become a lot more immersive, sometimes using new technologies. And in that way, it's become much more accessible. That we do know that contemporary art, with its often conceptual underpinnings, can sometimes be challenging for visitors. But I do think over the years it's become, I think, much more open and much more accessible to those who do encounter it, because there really is no right or wrong way of interpreting it. There is only your own interpretation. And so in that way, it's a very, I think, open and in some ways kind of transparent encounter. You know, you encounter an artwork, and your own response, whatever is elicited, is your own response. There is no right or wrong.
Right. Well, that's very interesting, and it relates to another similar question. What is the impact of the digital age having on the creation of art and on the accessibility of art? I mean, I guess the question from Alex is, has COVID accelerated any trends? Well, I think it's accelerated this particular trend, which is having online discussions about art. But could you answer that question, Melissa?
I think we are in some ways still in this COVID moment. We are having this wonderful virtual conversation with viewers from around the world. And I think that while we could very well say that our Zoom virtual encounters have in some ways made the location of where we're at less relevant, the artwork that comes from this moment will be, is still to be seen. You could certainly say that it has prompted many artists to have greater facility with technology. But at the same time, I think a lot of artists have gone back to their studios and continue to explore what we might call as more conventional media, such as paintings and sculptures and other handmade, hand-wrought, hand-rendered objects too.
Right. Well, it relates to a question from Michelle. Michelle McDonald asks, in the coming summit, will there be artworks actually people can visit and see here in Honolulu?
So my understanding is that the summit, it really was not intended as an exhibition so much as a series of conversations. And it really is conceived of as a prelude to the Hawaiʻi Triennial that we have scheduled for next February. And so there won't be physical artworks, but there'll be many artists speaking. So you'll be able to see their work virtually and hear from some of the world's leading theorists and artists and art critics and filmmakers about what they think is really important today in this moment.
Great, and we'll hopefully, COVID willing, see some artists visit these shores next year for the Triennial itself. And I have one of our featured artists here today with us, Justine Youssef. Welcome, Justine. I'm still having gremlins and I can't see anyone on the screen, but hopefully you can hear me. And I'll just turn to Melissa. We'd love for you to engage in this conversation. Over to you, Melissa.
Thank you, Jane. Hi, Justine. I'm sorry I can't see you, but welcome from Sydney.
Thank you so much for having me.
I know it's early-ish morning there. How are you spending your day? Yeah. How are you spending your day?
So it's the 27th today, a day after January 26th. So I'm back in the studio this morning. It's almost 10 a.m. My studio is in front of a construction site, so I hope you're not picking up on any of those sounds. But yeah, I'm excited to join this conversation.
And our viewers saw a few images of your work. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you've been spending these COVID days. I'm very aware in Australia there hasn't been the same level of lockdown as in the United States, but tell us if this has been a moment of pause or respite or just quiet studio time for you. How have you been spending these past few months?
So yeah, I guess in a way I'm super privileged to be here on Darug land in Sydney,
Yes.
where the situation isn't as intense as it is in the States. And I'm so sorry to hear that you're all going through all of that. I've been spending quite a bit of time in a home studio. It's been a little tricky for me to catch public transport. We have had some level of lockdown here as well. Yeah, but to an extent, I've been able to work from home and bring my practice to my tiny apartment. So yeah, I guess I'm really lucky in that respect.
Are you working towards an exhibition or body of work, Justine?
Yeah, actually, I'm developing a body of work that was brought up in one of the slides you showed earlier. The work that surrounds scent and the process of making rose water. Yeah, right now I'm really focused on building my relationship with scent in my practice and different distilling techniques that I've learned from my family in my village in Lebanon. In the spirit of Hawaiʻi Triennial, I'm also looking a lot more into contested histories, trying to really understand how my community ended up here on Darug land, displaced to Australia, trying to understand what it means to practice migrant settler culture here on colonized and stolen First Nations land, trying to learn how to be a better ally for First Nations people. Yeah, I think right now my practice is working on building on that earlier work that I developed for 4A.
It's Jane here, Justine. Thank you. That's a very interesting account of life in Sydney today, the day after Australia Day there, when we saw protests as well as celebrations all mixed together really in a very complex day. Justine, a question for you and or Melissa. It comes from Ricardo, and Ricardo's very interested in the use of new technology and different types of mediums in art, and he's talked about 3D printers and of course virtual reality. Justine, I noticed you have some video within your installations and all sorts of different things. Could you comment on the use of technology? I guess from my point of view, my question would be, how do artists really master the technology in order to immerse it into their art? And then perhaps, Melissa, you could follow with a comment about technology in contemporary art.
Thank you for that question. I suppose at the moment, technology has been fed into my practice by way of research. You know, a lot of my practice does delve into my community here on Darug land, but also reconnects with people in my village back in Lebanon. I do that through family WhatsApp group chats. I guess technology has been embodied in my practice by way of communicating and bridging communities across oceans. As you mentioned, I do have like a video element in my practice as well. But to a degree, my practice is relatively pared back in terms of to what degree I engage with technology at the moment. Yeah, I think that's what I can speak on for the moment in terms of that. But it's a super interesting question.
Right. Well, Melissa, do you want to comment on that question?
Yeah, I would add that today technology is one medium or element of many different ways that artists create works. And where once, you know, artists might have identified as a painter or a sculptor, where the genres were more distinct. Today, I think there's a real kind of openness to the idea of kind of an artist having an idea and then trying to find the right medium with which to express it. And so I think technology is just one piece of that, that we live in a moment when artists have many things at their fingertips to be able to create art with.
Indeed, that's the way it's always been, I guess, the technology, the access to information and the way art expresses itself throughout society changes all the time. We just have more ways of engaging these days. And I think we're nearly at the end of our time. We've had a couple of questions about whether this video and discussion will be posted online. And yes, we're going to put it up on the Australian Consulate-General in Honolulu website, so you can click on the video at any time. And we're going to feature it on our Facebook page. So again, Facebook, Australian Consulate-General in Honolulu, you'll find that link. And we'll put up some different posts featuring the various artists, and also featuring and advertising the coming Art Summit, 10th to 13th of February here in Honolulu, an online event. Anyone can participate from anywhere in the world. And I want to thank Catherine Don and Drew Broderick for engaging with us on that. We're very pleased to be associated with that. And of course, to thank Governor and Mrs. Ige for their support, to thank Christine Fisher for organising this event, which was no mean feat. And I have to tell you, part of the technological problems we've had this morning is that our colleague in Washington was going to help host the event, and one of the telecommunications companies was down, and she couldn't do it, so we had to scramble here. But so thanks to Chrissy in particular for all of that. NMG for the lovely video that we organised, and most particularly to Dr Melissa Chiu, Curatorial Director of the Hawaiʻi Triennial 2022, which should be a magnificent event. So with that, I can't see you, but I will say, have a wonderful celebration of Australia, all things Australia. Thank you for Hawaii, the people of Hawaii, for being such a great partner in this and everything else we do here. And have a great Australia Day here in Hawaii. So bye-bye for now. And thank you, Melissa.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you to everyone. It's been great to be with you this evening, and acknowledging our Indigenous history, heritage, and peoples. All the best.